Hey everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Now if you're watching this video, I bet you just completed the installation of your Delta EverEdge bathtub. So congratulations! We're now ready to move on to installing a matching wall set and finishing up your enclosure. Now if you haven't installed an EverEdge tub yet, be sure to check out our separate video that will walk you through those steps first. Now in this video, the shelves on the wall might look a little different than yours at home. Note that any differences are purely an aesthetic design feature and won't affect the installation steps. Now, when starting any plumbing related project, it's always a good idea to go ahead and shut off the water supply. So be sure to do that before you start the installation. Before we begin, we want to make sure you're watching the right video. So let's confirm a few things. First, take a look at your installation booklet or packaging to confirm what series you've selected. Now, this video will cover installing Delta's EverEdge 60 by 32 inch bathtub wall set. Now, keep in mind, building codes are different everywhere. Also, if there's a task that seems a little bit beyond your abilities, we definitely recommend contacting a professional for a little additional help. You can also make sure you're totally comfortable with all of these steps by fully reviewing this video before diving in. It's also good to know that this is really a two-person job because there are certainly some steps along the way that require an extra set of hands. One thing to note, we'll be using a dual-purpose polymer adhesive and sealant for our install. However, you can use a construction adhesive as long as it's labeled safe for plastic or an advanced waterproof sealant. Next, let's collect the tools and supplies we may need to complete this installation. Those include some safety glasses, a caulk gun, adhesive, sealant, a tape measure, a staple gun, some sill plate gasket, a level, a Carpenter square, some shims, a drop cloth, a pencil, a utility knife, a 3/16 inch drill bit, a bit holder extension, a driver bit, 1¼ inch stainless or zinc plated truss head screws, 2½ inch construction screws, a hole saw, some lumber, some gloves, and some sawhorses. Okay, if you're ready, we're ready. So let's get started. All right, so before we begin, the first thing I've done is to put a piece of cardboard in the bottom of my tub. What this does is help ensure that I'm not going to damage the tub while I'm working in it, and also make sure that I don't drop anything down the drain. So next we want to check to make sure that our rough opening is level, plumb, and square. So to do this, I'm going to check for plumb by using my longer level here. I'm going to hold it vertically along my rough framing, and then checking the bubble to make sure I'm in between the lines. And I want to check each of my locations all the way around the opening. Next, I also want to make sure that my walls are square. So to check for square, I'm going to use my Carpenter square. And I'm going to start in one of my back corners down along the edge of the flange of the tub. I'm going to place the square tight into the corner, and what I'm looking for here is making sure that the rough framing is evenly contacting each edge of the square on each side. Looks pretty good down there. Now I want to check the middle and also the top of this corner. All right, that side's looking pretty good, and I want to make sure I check the other corner as well. Finally, I want to check to make sure that my tub is sitting level. So for this, I'm going to use my shorter level. Start on one side, place it along the deck. Just again, making sure that bubble is perfectly in between the two lines. I'm going to check the other side, and then also along the back of the tub as well. Okay, so my rough opening here is looking pretty plumb, level, and square, so there's no adjustments necessary. However, if yours at home has any areas that need a little bit of help, now is the time to make those fine-tuned adjustments because it's by far the easiest time to do so, and also it'll help ensure that your installation goes well down the road. So go ahead and make any fine-tuned adjustments that you need at this point. Come back here, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now for this step of the installation, we're going to be adding some blocking to our existing framing to provide a little bit of additional support. Now you'll see I've gone ahead and added that blocking just so you can see what it's going to look like when it's all done, and I can walk you through where it needs to go. Now the places we're going to be adding the blocking to are in the middle two stud bays along our back wall, and then in the middle stud bay on each side wall. Now the height of the blocking is important. So for the back wall, I want to make sure my blocking is sitting 48 inches above the bottom plate of my wall. So I'm going to take my tape measure, make sure I'm contacting the bottom plate down at the bottom of my wall, and then making a reference line at 48 inches, and that will tell me exactly where we need that blocking to be located. Now, same idea on the sidewalls, except the dimension is going to be slightly higher. I need the sidewalls to be sitting 50 3/8 of an inch off my bottom plate. Again, making those reference lines. Now for the blocking material, you can use either 2x4 or 1x4 material. Now on my empty stud bays along the back wall and the side wall behind me, I've used 2x4 material. However, on my mixing valve and rough plumbing side, I'm using 1x4 material because I have this additional plumbing in that wall that needs a little bit of extra clearance, so the 1x4 provides that. Now to hold everything in place, I'm using 2.5-inch construction screws, and the important thing is making sure that when I install it, all of my blocking is sitting perfectly flush with my existing framing. All right, with all that said, go ahead and make your reference lines, cut and install your blocking, and they'll be ready to move on to the next step of the installation. Next, we're going to move along to installing our door nailers. Now what door nailers are is a little bit of additional framing we're going to apply to the existing framing to make sure we have the support necessary for a shower door. So technically, if you're not planning on installing a shower door, you could skip this step. However, I definitely recommend it's a good idea to go ahead and do it either way. That way you're future-proofing your install. Now the door nailers, there's going to be 4 of them, and we can use either 2x4 or 2x6 material. Personally, I think it's a good idea to use 2x6 material because it makes it that much easier to apply the door nailer to the existing framing. Now each door nailer needs to be 57 inches long, and we want to make sure it's offset from our existing framing by 2 3/16 of an inch. So you can see I made a little reference line at the bottom and another one at the top here at 2 3/16 of an inch, so I know exactly how much that offset needs to be.
Another important measurement is the height at which we mount this door nailer. Now we want to make sure that the bottom of the door nailer is sitting 1 inch above the flange of the bathtub. So if you come down here, you'll see that I've made a reference mark that's exactly 1 inch above the top flange of the bathtub. Also, I've added a little bit of additional blocking on the back side here at that mark, which makes it just that much easier when installing this door nailer, because that way I can install my door nailer by setting it down on that block and then worrying about my offset mark that I'm going to show you in a second. So once you have the blocking installed and the mark made, we can take our door nailer. And again, I'm going to make sure that it's contacting my block and is at the correct height. And I like starting at the bottom because this way I can keep an eye not only on the height, but also the offset at the same time, making sure the position looks perfect. All right, once that looks good, I'm going to hold the bottom in place with a 2.5-inch construction screw. After that, I'm going to move back up top, checking my top line here. Again, keeping an eye on that to make sure my offset is correct. Once it looks good there, I'm going to also secure the top with another construction screw. Once that's done, I'm going to put 2 more screws roughly evenly spaced down the backside to really lock this into place. After that's in place, I'm going to take my other door nailer here and apply it directly to the back of the first one, making sure that it's mounted perfectly in line with not only the height, but also flush with the front edge of my first door nailer. Once both of those are in place, I'm going to move to the other side and do the same exact steps. Okay, now we can move on to dry fitting our panels in our opening. So I started by dry fitting my back panel here, making sure it's sitting along the deck of my tub on each side, and also taking special care to make sure I don't damage the panel as I move it in around my rough plumbing, and I also don't want to damage the rough plumbing itself. Now with that in place, I'm going to start dry fitting the panel that's opposite the side of the rough plumbing. So I've got my other side here. I'm going to lift it into place. And again, I want to make sure it's contacting the deck of the tub and connecting with my back panel at the same time. Now what I'm looking for here is making sure that I've got my panel going around those door nailers and is flat against my framing here. You notice I'm still kicked down at the bottom a little bit. The 2 panels will snap together with just a little push. Okay, now with those snapped in place, I can check for alignment. So what I'm checking is making sure the 2 panels are even along the top, that the front edge of my wall set is even with the front of my tub, and that I'm getting good connection along the deck of my tub and also at the seam between the 2 panels. All right, everything's looking perfect here. So now we can move on to dry fitting our third panel. Now when we move on to dry fitting our third panel, the side that's on the rough plumbing wall, you'll notice that if we try to dry fit the panel now, we won't be able to get good contact with the framing behind because the back of the panel would contact all of our stub outs here and prevent it from fully seating on the wall. So in order to dry fit this panel, we're going to have to first cut some holes to accommodate our rough plumbing. All right, next we're going to determine the center points of those holes that we need to drill in the side panel. Now, this is very important because we're only going to get one chance at drilling these holes in the correct location, so take a lot of care with this step. Now to determine the center point of the holes that we need to drill, we're going to take 2 measurements per hole, one vertical and one horizontal, the intersection of which will determine the center point of those holes that we're drilling. So for the vertical measurements, we're going to be measuring off the deck of the tub up to the center of the point of each hole that we need to drill. Got my tape measure, again contacting the deck of my tub, and I'm going to make note of the 2 measurements to the center of each of those points. Okay? All right, now that I've got those vertical measurements, we're going to take our horizontal measurements. Now the horizontal measurements are going to be measured off a line that's plumb with the front edge of my tub here. So for this, I like to use my long level again. I'm going to hold it tight against the front of my tub, checking the bubble to make sure I'm plumb, and then use my tape measure, stretching it across, measuring from the level to the center point of my rough valve, and then also the center point of my tub spout. Okay, great. So now I have the horizontal and the vertical measurements that will dictate the center point of those 2 holes that I need to cut. Now again, just like I said before, we're only gonna get one shot at getting this right. So as a little bit of a pro tip, I think it's a great idea to go ahead and make yourself a cardboard template, transfer the points to that, and make kind of a test run to make sure everything is looking great before we cut those holes in the side panel for real. So my cardboard template here, you notice the first thing I have is that I've put a big arrow on it to make sure I know which way is up and which way is the front. Also, I want to make sure that my bottom edge and the front edge are perfectly straight and at 90 degrees to one another. And finally, in the lower corner here, I've made a little bit of a notch that will accommodate the little dam that's on the deck of the tub down below. Just to test fit it, I'm going to hold it up over the location I'm going to be drilling those holes, confirming that I'm contacting the tub of the deck evenly and that I can keep it in line with the front edge of the tub. Once that looks good, I'm going to take my vertical measurements I made before, transfer them to my template, and then intersect them with those horizontal measurements, and those will be the 2 holes that I need to be cutting into my template and eventually into my panel. Now, size of the holes is also extremely important. I want to make sure that I'm cutting a hole that's large enough to accommodate my rough valve, but not too large that it would extend beyond whatever rough trim I'm going to be installing later. And then for my tub spout, I'm going to go ahead and cut a hole that's 1 inch in diameter. So if you've got those measurements and you're feeling confident, let's go ahead and transfer them to our cardboard template here. Then we'll come back here and test fit it to make sure everything's looking great before moving on to cutting our panel. All right, so I've got my holes in my template, and now we can go ahead and test fit it. So I'm going to hold the template with the arrow facing me and pointing up. I want to make sure the bottom edge of the template fully contacts the tub deck, and that the front edge, the leading edge of my template, is in line with the front of my tub. That looks perfect, so now I'm going to check my hole location and size, and everything is looking great. So the template has confirmed I've got the sizes and the locations correct, so now I can transfer those measurements over to my panel and make my final cuts. Moving along, we're going to be making 2 reference lines along my back and my side panels that are already in place. The first reference line is at each framing location marking the top of the flange. We're going to be using that in a later step. Next, I also want to mark a pilot hole location that we're going to be drilling at each of my framing locations. It's going to be not only in the center of the framing, but also in the center of the flange from the top to the bottom there. So I'm just going to make a little dot that'll indicate where I want to drill that pilot hole. I'm going to do that all the way around the opening. And then on my side panel here, on the leading edge flange, I also want to drill some pilot holes. I want to make sure I make a mark at the top, one at the bottom, one in the middle, and then I'm going to split the difference above and below that middle dot. And what that will leave me with is 5 pilot hole locations that are roughly evenly spaced along the leading edge here. Once you've marked all those locations, we're going to pull the panels back out and move on to cutting some holes.
We've got our side panel out and up on sawhorses because we're about to drill the hole for our mixing valve. Now it's really important you make sure you have the correct side panel and that it's in the correct orientation. So we've made sure that ours is facing up, and I know that this is the bottom because it's the shorter side with no flange on it. So now it's really helpful to have 2 people for this step, and I'll show you why. So grab your tape measure. You're going to place it on the lip of the wall panel and then slide it across till it's level. Now the second person can get a bird's eye view and transfer that measurement.
Just like Hannah said, it's really important that this tape measure stays perfectly level because since the wall panel is contoured, we're not able to hold the tape measure flat onto the surface we're cutting and still get an accurate measurement. So again, keeping that tape measure perfectly level, you want to get your eye directly above the measurement you're trying to transfer to the wall panel, and then transfer that measurement down to the panel itself. I'm going to do the vertical measurement for the mixing valve and also the vertical measurement for the tub spout rough. Again, getting my eye directly above the tape measure and transferring that down to my panel. Now for the horizontal, it's going to be very similar. coming off this front edge of the wall panel. Again, making sure the tape measure is perfectly level side to side. Get your eye directly above the point you need to transfer, and then transfer it down again for the mixing valve and also for the tub spout rough.
Okay, now that we know the intersecting points of our vertical and horizontal measurements, we can go ahead and use a hole saw to cut our holes. Now for our mixing valve, we're gonna use a 4-inch hole saw, but you'll wanna use whatever is appropriate for the size mixing valve that you have. And for our tub spout rough, we're gonna use a 1-inch hole saw.
Now when you drill these holes, it's extremely important we get them exactly centered over those points we just marked. So it could be helpful to drill a little bit of a pilot hole to help keep your hole saw centered as you drill down through it. However, if you're careful and you go slow, just be super sure that you're getting that hole in the exact correct position, because again, we're only gonna get one shot at doing this right. So if everything's looking good, let's go ahead and move on to cutting it.
Now that we have our holes drilled, we can dry fit our last wall panel. So I'm gonna fit it over my rough plumbing here, being careful not to damage the wall panel or the plumbing as I do so, making sure it's tight against my framing on the wall, and then I'm gonna check for alignment. First, I'm gonna check to make sure that my wall panel is sitting evenly on the deck of the tub at the bottom, that the front edge of my wall panel is even with the front edge of my tub, and then finally, I wanna check my hole size and locations to make sure everything's looking good, which it is. So if everything's looking great, I'm gonna hold the wall panel on the wall and then mark the same 2 reference lines that I did on the other wall panels. First, the straight line across the top at each framing location. And then second, I'm also gonna mark my pilot hole locations. A little dot in the center of the flange, along the top. And then don't forget to do the 5 along the front edge here. 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, 1 in the middle, and then split the difference between those for 5 relatively evenly spaced marks. Okay, once everything's marked up, we're gonna pull the panel back out of the opening and move on to drilling our pilot holes.
Now I have a 3/16 inch drill bit and an extended bit holder. That's to make sure that the spinning chuck of my drill doesn't damage my wall panel when I'm drilling my pilot holes. So go ahead and drill all of your pilot holes at the marks we made earlier on all 3 of our wall panels.
Next, we need to apply this fire retardant pad to the back side of the mixing valve hole that we just cut. So I've got my panel and I've turned it around so the back is facing out. I'm going to be applying this pad with this adhesive side down on the panel, making sure that again this pad's fully covering that hole. Now the back side of the pad has 2 sides that are paper backed. I'm going to go ahead and remove one side first, and then I can use that to help me center the pad directly over the hole. Then once I've got that side pushed down, I'm going to remove the other side of the paper backing and push the rest of the pad over the hole, making sure I've got it fully stuck on the back side of the panel. Okay, with that in place, now we need to cut out the hole itself. So I'm gonna use my utility knife. Start by making an X from side to side. And then after that, I can work my way around the hole, being very careful not to damage the wall panel or to cut my finger. All right, we've got that hole all cut, so we're ready to move on to the next step. Now it's time to install our foam tape along our flange of our bathtub. Now the foam tape itself has one side that's sticky, and that's the side we're going to be pressing along the flange. And the important thing to remember here is that the position does matter. So we want the foam tape to start just to the inside of the front edge dam here on the bathtub flange. And then also I want to make sure that the position of the foam tape is just along the deck of the bathtub, but not actually contacting the deck itself. So when you're ready, you can go ahead and peel off the first 12 inches or so of the paper backing. I like to work in sections. And then I'm gonna start it again, checking that position, starting it just on the inside edge of that dam and right along the deck, but not actually sticking to the deck itself. Pull a little bit more paper, and just keep working all the way around the tub, going over the screws, making sure I'm getting good contact and keeping that right along the deck of the tub itself. Now as I get to the corner here, I think this is important to point out too. I want to make sure that I'm making sure the tape is going all the way back in the corner, so I'll use my finger to make sure I'm pushing it all the way in the back corner, and then work my way around the rest of the tub. And as I get to the end here, you may have a little bit of extra. That's totally okay. We just want to make sure that we trim whatever excess tape that we have using scissors or utility knife. Just be careful that you don't damage the finish of the bathtub itself. And we're going to have the end of the tape exactly same as it was on the other side, just the inside of that front edge dam there. All right, now that I have that foam tape in place, I'm going to give one last check around my opening, making sure that the tape is fully in contact with the flange, the position looks good, and also checking both of my corners to make sure that I've pushed it all the way back in there and everything's looking perfect. So once you've got that done, we're ready to move on. Now we're ready to apply our sill plate gasket to our rough framing. Now the purpose of this is to help reduce noise, and it's not included in your materials, so you'll have to purchase it. We're also going to be holding it on the wall using our staple gun. Now, we're going to apply it to the middle 3 studs on our back panel wall here, as well as the cross braces that we added earlier. And also, position is important. We want to make sure that the sill gasket starts 4 inches below those top reference lines that we drew, and then run it all the way down, stopping 2 inches above the flange of the bathtub. Okay, if you've got all that and you're ready, let's get to it. Next, we're going to apply some adhesive to our back wall framing. Now, you can use an adhesive that's safe for plastic or an advanced polymer sealant. I'm going to apply a bead of adhesive that's about double as thick as the sill gasket that we just applied in the previous step. Like before, I'm going to start 4 inches down from my top reference line here, working my way down the corner, but this time I'm going to go all the way to just above the flange of the tub. I'm going to make sure I hit both corners as well as the little gaps between the sill gasket and the flange of the bathtub. Okay, let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have our sill gasket and our adhesive in place, we can move on to securing our back panel to our rough framing. So I've got it in place here. I'm going to push it all the way tight against the framing behind it. All right, great. Now at this point, I want to check for some alignment. I want to make sure that my wall set is sitting directly on the deck of my bathtub. I also want to make sure that my corners are looking good, that nothing's getting pinched. And I also think it's a great idea to check those reference lines we drew along the top earlier, just to make sure everything's looking great. Now at this point, I can go ahead and start securing my back panel to my rough framing using some screws. Now the screws I'm going to use are 1.25 inches long, and they're truss or pan head screws. Also, you'll notice on my drill, I have a drill bit extender to make sure that the spinning chuck of the drill isn't going to come in contact with my wall set, which could cause a little bit of damage. Also, when I tighten these screws in, I don't want to over tighten them. I just need them to be snug to the framing behind to make sure it locks it into place. And finally, as you're working your way across this top flange at each of those pilot hole locations, if you have any gaps that are greater than, say, 1/8 of an inch, I definitely recommend dropping a shim back behind the flange and the rough framing to make sure you close that gap before securing it in place with a screw. If everything's looking good, let's go ahead and lock this back panel in place. Next, we're going to apply some more sill plate gasket, except this time to our sidewalls. And on each sidewall, we're going to apply it to the middle 2 studs, and just like before, start at 4 inches down from our top reference line here. The difference is we're going to extend the sill plate gasket this time all the way down to the top edge of our bathtub flange. So let's go ahead and do that. Now this next step you could technically skip if you're not planning on installing a shower door. However, I personally recommend that you go ahead and do it to future-proof your installation. That way, if you change your mind down the road and decide you do want that shower door after all, you're totally covered. We're going to be adding a bead of sealant to our bathtub. We're going to start at the top of the flange here, coming down and then all the way along the top of the dam. And you can see I made a little reference line 2 inches off of that flange. At that point, we're going to make a right-hand turn towards the inside of the bathtub and go for another 3 inches. I'm going to do that to both sides of my bathtub. Now we're gonna move on to installing our side panels. Now our side panels are gonna install very similarly to how the back panel did. The only difference here is just like during the dry fit phase, we wanna make sure that our side panel is snapping together with our back panel. So I've already got it in place here, taking care, making sure that I don't damage my plumbing rough-ins. Then I'm going to push it against the wall, and then with just a little push, it'll snap in place with my back panel. Okay, this is looking great, so I can go ahead and move on to securing my panel in place. Now I'm gonna do it just like I did with my back panel, using those 1¼ inch long truss or pan head screws, and keeping an eye on any gaps I may have at my framing locations. I'm gonna attach those screws at each one of my pilot holes, along the top, and also along this front flange from the top to the bottom. Once I've done this side, I'll repeat the same exact steps on the other side, and that'll about wrap up this installation.
Okay, so finish screwing in the rest of your panels and score and snap off any shims that you may have used. Also, let the adhesive cure according to the manufacturer's instructions. Once that's done, that about wraps things up. Now the final step in this installation comes after your finished walls are in, like mine are here. You'll need to add a bead of sealant to all of the outer edges of your wall set. Now the great thing about this wall set is that you don't have to apply any sealant to any of the interior seams. Also, there are a lot of different options out there about how to finish up this project, but you'll probably want to add a shower door or a shower curtain. All right, this looks great. Now we hope this video is helpful and you're as happy with your project at home as we are with ours. Now if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to the Delta Faucet customer service team. They're more than happy to help.